Okay, everybody, welcome back to the conference. Very short break. Just before we get to the next session, which is going to be Devyani Sharma's accent bias session, I'm just going to give you another quick reminder about who we are and why we're putting this conference on. So Sanctuary graduates are the early careers attraction and recruitment experts. We've built campus networks and university partnerships, which allow us to reach any student at all UK universities. We're helping hundreds of businesses reach, attract, and hire the best, most diverse graduates, interns, and apprentices. Diversity does really run through the core of our business, and more than half of our clients come to us with a diversity issue as their main reason for working with us. Our expertise in diversity and our proud partnership with the Social Mobility Foundation allows us to put this annual conference together. We provide funding to support disadvantaged students at our partner universities. We donate money from every diversity client campaign to our partners, the Social Mobility Foundation, and we deliver expert sessions to our university partners. If you want to learn more about how we can help your university, then please do get in touch. Just a quick reminder here of the different services that we do offer employers, all the way from diversity attraction marketing to end-to-end process management for graduates, interns, and apprentices. And for those of you who manage your own recruitment but might need attraction and marketing support, here are the options we have. This includes driving diverse applications and ensuring you have diverse students at your events, as well as managing your entire early careers marketing strategy. If you'd like to know more about what we do and how we can help you, then please do get in touch with myself and I can point you in the right direction. Okay, so that brings me nicely on to our next session of the day. Okay, so I'll just stop the screen sharing for the moment before I introduce Devyani. So I came across a really interesting report at the start of the year called Speaking Up, commissioned by the Sutton Trust. So this report looks at accent bias throughout the life course, including accent anxiety and experiences of discrimination. It also looks at how these experiences differ depending on your social economic background and how this has an implication on people's social mobility. So we're really lucky today to be joined by one of the co-authors of this report, Devyani Sharma. Devyani is a professor of social linguistics at Queen Mary, University of London. And she's here today to present findings from the report and hopefully answer as many questions as possible at the end. How are you doing, Devyani?
Good. Thank you so much for the invitation. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Yeah, we can hear you. So yeah, thanks again. Nice to see you again. And thanks for coming along. I'm really looking forward to this. And I know plenty of people have been asking us about it. So yeah, really looking forward to it. Are you going to share your slides? That's right, Devyani,
yes, hopefully that will work. So shall I try now?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, that looks okay for me. Yeah, that's all good. So yeah, Devyani, I'll leave you to it and then we'll be back for questions shortly. Just a reminder to everyone, please do put your questions into the Q&A and then we'll try and get to as many as we can towards the end of the session.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Thank you so much again for the invitation. It's really an exciting event and fantastic for me to have a chance to learn more about the recruiting side that we work on from an academic perspective and share some of what we've found with you. So as Chris said, I'll try and keep the talk to 20 minutes so that we have a good 10 minutes for discussion. So apologies if I skip over a few slides a little quickly. But let me just check. Do interrupt if you're having any trouble seeing the slides, of course. So I thought I would begin with work that preceded the work we've been doing for about 5 years. And that's the more general research that's shown a number of barriers in terms of access to elite professions. So this 2015 report that you see on the slide here looked at problems with implicit criteria in hiring. So the tendency to recruit in one's own image, which might be skewed to middle and higher classes recruiting, and also notions, these kind of slippery notions of talent and polish, which also tend to conflate professionalism with a certain kind of middle class manner. So our project was really interested in looking at what the role of accent is in these implicit biases. It was surprisingly understudied for a nation like the UK, where accent is clearly very important. So our team has worked on a number of related studies. I won't talk about all of our work today, just a few highlights. And I'm going to look at, first of all, what the problem is, to pinpoint what we're actually talking about when we talk about accent bias, and then what evidence we might have of it. We don't want to assume that it is exercised in moments like recruiting or in the workplace, and then end with a few points about what we can do about it. So to begin with, when we talk about accent bias, we need to move away from the idea that only bad people have negative bias, that the expectation should be that we have no reactions when we hear an accent. Every person in the world has some accent, but also every human being has bias. So that's how our brains work. We have systematic deviations based on what we expect. So you're hearing my accent and it triggered certain responses. They can even be positive or negative, or just familiarity and so on. So we have natural social stereotypes that get triggered by accent. We can't really avoid that. But we talk about accent-based discrimination, although I'll use the word bias for it, when we rely on those kinds of stereotypes to judge independent traits like skills or competence. And of course, this tends to be addressed with unconscious bias training, which I'll mention the positives and negatives of that at the end of the talk. So as I said, in the context of Britain, this work really needs to be done because for centuries, accent has been the basis of social hierarchy and social structure. So if you see this quote from Charlene White, the first Black woman to present ITV News, she said, "I don't have the South London accent anymore because my parents sent me to elocution lessons from the age of 9. I guess they had foresight." And I like this quote because it shows the direct intervention by people who might not have the standard accent or the desirable accent to eliminate it, but also the participation. So how, she says, I guess they had foresight, so kind of acceptance of that status quo. And we see in many professions a tendency to try and eliminate strong accents. So one thing to note before we look at findings in our work is what the legal status of discrimination based on accent is. Accent is, of course, not a protected characteristic itself, but the crucial thing to recognize with accent is that it signals many protected characteristics. It can signal ethnicity, age, sexuality, gender. I put class in parentheses because class itself is not strictly a protected characteristic. So linguists who work on these processes know that when people say negative things about accent, it's often about the social group, and it becomes a direct route for discrimination against these groups. Awareness has increased. So me talking to you today is an example of that. And we've been very pleasantly surprised by how seriously the corporate sector has engaged with this issue. But awareness of how much we rely on accent as a shortcut for assumptions about people is still quite low. So people are still willing to openly express bias against an accent when they wouldn't just express bias against that social group directly. So I'll come back to that point of how aware people are at the end. So I'm going to move on to a couple of kinds of evidence that we have that accent bias really does arise when, especially in the context of recruiting or professional interactions. And as I said, we don't want to assume that it plays a role, but that's why we've done a number of studies. And I'm just selecting a couple of studies we've done over the last few years as examples. So when we set out to do this work, one of the things we wanted to know was what current attitudes to accents are and whether they've changed in the last 50 years. But we also wanted specifically to understand social mobility and fair access implications. So do these kinds of biases influence recruiters and even if somebody gets a job, their co-workers' judgments? For example, is an underrepresented accent heard as less qualified for a kind of work, even if the candidate gives the same answer as somebody speaking in a standard accent? We focused on the sector of law as an elite profession that has both a history of being very narrow in terms of accent representation, but also as a sector that's been trying to engage with these issues. So we were really focused on access to elite professions. And in our initial surveys before we started doing our work, we did find statements like the one here where a lawyer said, I hate to admit it, but I will assume that someone with a posh accent is better educated, more intelligent, more reliable. I should say, I don't think it's right. It's just a snap judgment. But we knew that things were changing as well. So we wanted to know the extent of the problem. So I'm going to show you 4 quick snapshots or headlines from some of our studies. And the first is really the simplest. It's not the main kind of work we do. And it was just to see how people respond to the name of an accent. So at this point, we're not even talking about hearing voices, just we gave a large representative sample of respondents across the UK labels that you see here, and we asked how prestigious or how pleasant they felt these accents were. And the main point to note here, it's just a kind of background survey we did where we replicated one that was done 50 years ago, is that this understanding of social prestige of accents has not changed in the country. So you can see very little change here. If you look at the green line from 50 years ago and the blue line, which is ours, we see received pronunciation, RP, the prestigious standard accent at the top. And we see certain national standard accents, including a non-native accent, which is interesting. And at the bottom, we tend to see working class accents from industrial, urban contexts and minority ethnic accents. So we see little change in this hierarchy, but we don't get a lot of information about whether, knowing that there are these attitudes out there, which is all we're asking, whether that really affects a job interview situation. Maybe people set this information aside when they're in that situation. So the second finding that I'll describe to you now is that we do see some evidence that this hierarchy does play into how people hear a job candidate and whether they think they're competent, in this case, for a trainee position at a law firm. So we had mock job candidate recordings. I don't have time to go, it's a complex kind of design in this work, but about 1,000 listeners heard different job candidates giving different answers to job interview questions. But the way the study is designed is we can pick out responses that were identical in terms of the words that were said and only different in terms of accent and see if there was a difference. So what you can see in the table at the bottom left is that we looked at social class as one dimension that could be a problem in terms of bias, north, south, so regional difference, and also an ethnic difference within the London voices. So a typically white accent from London and an accent associated with multi-ethnic groups. So in our case, 2 Black speakers. So I'm just going to play you their voices so you can hear. This is the standard accent.
I worked as a part-time shop manager.
So that's just an extract. People heard 30-minute clips. This is working class London, typically white speakers.
I worked as a part-time shop manager.
A Black speaker.
I worked as a part-time shop manager.
Middle class Northern.
I worked as a part-time shop manager.
And working class Leeds.
I worked as a part-time shop manager.
So I'll just show you, I know this is a bit quick, but I'll just show you one of the things we found with these recordings. And what you see here is that younger listeners did not make big differences in terms of whether they perceived the candidate as suitable for a job in law. I should say, as I said, the responses were 30 seconds and they were responding to real questions asked in job interviews for at law firms. We worked with law firms to devise those. So younger people didn't make differences. It was at around middle age that we saw the two working class Southern accents significantly downgraded, not in terms of whether people like the accents, but in terms of whether they would be good lawyers. And this is a comparison where the individuals are saying exactly the same thing. So we see a social class bias simply based on the voice. And we also found that, so as I said, it emerged with middle-aged and above listeners, more such bias amongst listeners in the south of England and in higher social classes. You might think this looks good because younger people don't have bias, so they'll just get older and then the bias will have disappeared. But other work we've done suggests that this is a change that happens in the lifespan. So, and change may also be happening in the real world, but it's very likely that those younger people who generally give these high ratings because they're idealistic and, you know, they may become more normative and standard oriented as they enter the workplace and become employers. So it can change with age. So I'm going to move on to two other findings and then talk about how we try and tackle some of these issues. So a third finding I thought would be good to note because it addresses intersectionality, which we talk about quite often now, where you might have a number of different social characteristics or positionings that are underrepresented in a particular sector or are otherwise stand out in a recruiting or employment situation. And what we found was a little troubling. So you might remember that we had two different northern accents, but also we had what's called multicultural London English, which is an East London accent that's developed recently. And our speakers were two Black men for the multicultural London English. And what we found was we had milder and stronger accents. We found that the mild multicultural London English, so the young Black man who had a milder accent, was one of the best rated. And we see this as a kind of positive reaction to somebody's, you know, you can recognize this person is from an underrepresented ethnic group, but the accent was close to a standard, just a hint of the ethnic background. But with the stronger accent, we saw a significant downgrading of competence ratings. So again, this is comparing two people who are saying the same thing in their job interview, exactly the same thing. But we see a significant kind of penalty, which we interpret as a failure to modify that accent. So that's very troubling because it suggests an openness to underrepresented accents, but as long as they're not too strong. And interestingly, for the northern accents, which are, of course, much less new, they're more established, very familiar for British listeners, we didn't see a significant difference. So there was slightly lower rating for the stronger accent, but not a significant downgrading. So this is actually an intersection of social class and ethnicity, where one individual out of these four is encountering a much stronger penalty simply for voice, because these are all saying the same thing. So that's very concerning. But there's a positive that I wanted to turn to, and now I'm going to just speed up a little bit to make sure I finish in about 5 minutes. We also tested a few other possible factors in how people hear job candidates in interviews. And one of the differences in the materials we were using, and as you'll know, I'm sure from doing job interviews, is that job interviews sometimes require expertise. So an example from our law firm context was, what's the difference between contract and tort? So that's something about law that the candidate needs to know. But a non-expert question would be, tell us about a time that you led a team well, something like that. And what we found was that all accents got a boost when they were using expert language or talking about expert content. So one important finding is that when candidates were talking about some kind of expertise and showing their expertise, listeners were falling back on accent stereotypes much less. And the second finding that's not shown on this slide was that we also checked whether how confidently they were talking was a factor, because a lot of lawyers said confidence is a big thing when we're recruiting. And we found that there was a huge effect if we had people speaking hesitantly, saying the same thing, they were downgraded much more than if they had an underrepresented accent. It seemed like speaking confidently would again get listeners to stop relying on accent stereotypes and engage with the speaker. So in our outreach work with students and applicants, we actually suggest doing the opposite of what people usually do. So people with underrepresented accents will often suppress them. They might mumble, they might try and hide it or fake a standard accent. And we actually say that's worse because lack of confidence comes across badly. It's actually better to just know what you're talking about and be confident, because we see clear evidence that accent bias reduces when you're coming across like that. It's worth noting that that's still an extra burden on the speaker of an underrepresented accent, because they have to be expert and be confident, but it's at least good to know that those things tend to reduce bias quite a lot. Just very briefly before I wrap up with how we address these issues, I wanted to turn to the more recent report we did that Chris mentioned. Everything I've told you about so far has been on the listener side. We wanted to know what biases are in the minds of the listeners. But we wanted to also find out whether speakers of accents, whether their experiences match the biases that I've talked about. So we did a large survey that we published with the Sutton Trust on speakers' experiences, and we focused on different life stages. So entering university, then being in university, but approaching entering your career, and then young professionals and senior professionals. And I'll just, again, give you a few highlights from that. First of all, we found some degree of concern about accent impeding success across all life stages. The numbers are not always that high, but we have to remember that this isn't a question of opinion. This should actually be close to zero. And the main point in this graph is to see that in all of our findings in this work, we found that university was when these anxieties peaked, when people are planning to enter their chosen career. Another example of something we found among early career employees was whether they had not just concern, but we wanted to know actual experience, whether their accent had been singled out or mocked or criticized in the workplace. You can see that respondents from the North, 40% of them said this had happened at some point, which was double those in the South. And I should mention that the South is overwhelmingly working class Londoners having that experience. So in the rest of the South, there's very, very low levels of such experiences. Secondly, among senior managers, you can see that there are also social class effects where more than half of senior managers from lower socioeconomic groups had that accent mocked or criticized or singled out in a social setting, less so in the workplace, but quite a high number in the workplace. We mentioned social settings because it is actually part of work. Socializing is actually quite an important part of satisfaction at work, and feeling like you don't belong can actually be built up in those casual interactions around work as well. So just a few examples. I can't go through these, but just so you get a sense of what people were talking about in this. The first one I list here is a reduced or compromised sense of belonging, which is a major concern. We also see the struggle to suppress an accent when accents are very, they're a part of who we are from childhood. So trying to act white, being told great candidate, shame about the voice after promotion interview, and being seen as a troublemaker if you mention anything about reactions to your accent. And also we found a lot of evidence of fear of exclusion from elite professions among university students. So you can see here very different very different lines of work being associated with standard speech, and individuals saying, I don't hear someone like me. And this can actually lead to self-exclusion as well. We focused a lot on exclusion by the listener, but you can also have people just not putting themselves forward for careers or for senior positions. So I want to finish in a minute, so I'm just going to very quickly mention how we approach solutions to these issues.
Devyani,
We have yeah.
Devyani, you can take
Yes.
your time with this. You've got a few minutes. It's okay. So you don't feel you have to
Okay.
rush. It's okay.
All right. So we have online materials that are free to use. And so we have an interactive tutorial that one that's for recruiters and employers and one that's for students. And they work through some of the points that I've raised, but they also have things like a self-assessment quiz. It doesn't really give you a bias number, but you can listen to job candidates for a law firm, for a position in a law firm, speaking in different accents, and you feel the surprise when you hear someone talking about something in an accent you don't associate it with the role. So we have some interactive materials if people have 15 minutes. We've also linked, we've worked with the Mobility Commission, who are on our advisory board, to embed a mention of accent in their professional services toolkits. In fact, one of the positives in our work on how to address these issues is that we found that just a simple focus on accent makes a difference. So I'll just show you what that means. One part of our work was to test whether interventions are effective. So we don't want to go out and tell people accent bias is a problem, you shouldn't do it, when it turns out that doesn't have any effect. So we wanted to know, does priming or preparing a recruiter with the knowledge that they might be exercising bias make a difference in their behavior? And we tested 5 different types of intervention that have been explored in management and psychology. I won't talk about all of them, because the one that worked the best was actually the simplest one, which was just raising awareness before recruiters did a mock recruiting task. So recruiters who had read this short statement before they judged candidates had fewer differences based on accent. So we don't want the effect to be, oh, they give the best rating to the person with the least represented accent. We want them just to listen to how good the candidate is. Maybe the person with an underrepresented accent is not good in the interview. That's fine. We just want them to ignore accent. And we achieve that with just a reminder that you see here, which is to tell recruiters that there is a tendency to rate standard accents more favorably. The focus should be on the skills, not the accent that they're using. And when recruiters weren't given that reminder, they tended to have the differences that I just showed you. But when they were, these differences tend to disappear. So there's an interesting, we were interested to find that because actually research shows that reminding people not to exercise gender bias or racial bias nowadays isn't always effective. And it's probably because that message has become saturated, and sometimes people might even be annoyed to be reminded, and it has no effect. But our interpretation of the fact that just telling people this is a kind of bias you might have, don't do it, the fact that it had an effect suggests people are not so aware that they're doing it. And people tell us that. They say, yeah, I realize it could be, but I hadn't actually thought about how I use it all the time as a shortcut to make assumptions. So in this case, this kind of unconscious bias training may still be useful because it's not quite as embedded in people's practices in key moments like recruiting. But one critique of unconscious bias that I want to mention is that, as you know, unconscious bias training only raises awareness of bias. It doesn't eliminate bias. So if I'm not used to hearing an MLE speaker in a law interview for a law firm, I can make sure I don't let that influence me. But the fact that I am surprised when I hear it is not changed by raising my awareness. So those underlying biases and stereotypes are only reduced through lifelong diverse exposure. And this relates to the next point, which is, I'm getting to the final couple of points, which is a critique of the common question, well, why don't people just switch to a standard accent at work? Because we know people could switch. So one of the reasons, so as linguists, we don't say you shouldn't code switch. Many people do. I'm probably doing it a little bit, giving this talk versus how I speak to my mom. So people can choose to do it, but to expect people to do it is problematic. So one is what I just mentioned, that we erase other voices from professional context by expecting it. So we maintain this particular regional, ethnic, class norm of what professional is, and we just maintain this absence of other voices and whole selves. So we continue to be surprised if someone has another accent, which is a problem. The second point that people don't always realize is that it is a lot of cognitive pressure to feel obligated to code switch. I always say, you know, if you're a standard speaker, think of trying to speak in a Scottish accent in a job interview and sound like a native Scottish accent user while you're trying to actually give good answers. So it adds cognitive pressure to expect that for people who are already often more anxious because they face disadvantage of other kinds. It can also lead to isolation from your own community. So being seen as a sellout, or she doesn't speak, you know, like where she's from anymore. And as I mentioned, this is quite unequal, this kind of expectation. Only certain people have to face that pressure. Accent is actually the hardest aspect of language to change and often the least relevant to work. So you might need technical vocabulary, you might need logic. As a lawyer, you probably do need logic, you need to be able to build an argument, but what accent you do it in is usually not that relevant. To expect people to change it is also very difficult. So just the final point that in leveling the field, our basic advice for speakers of different accents is that we have evidence that being confident and competent reduces biased listening. So focus on what you know your stuff. Don't over worry about accent. And for listeners, practice listening to what the person is saying, not how it's being pronounced. But in general, as the world changes, as it becomes more mobile, we need to shift as a society from an expectation that people conform to a single standard to expecting difference in the workplace. So I've hoped to have shown that accent bias does exist and lead to unequal outcomes. It places a burden on only certain individuals, but it can actually be addressed through quite simple awareness raising. Thank you so much. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Devyani. That was so interesting. And thanks for condensing it, because I'm sure I'll sound like a broken record, but everyone can speak longer on their chosen subject. So we appreciate you shortening it. Really, really interesting. I'm sure most people were just trying to take it in most of the time before thinking of their own questions. But you seem to touch on some really good stuff in terms of advice. I think a few people have tried to access the site as you've been live. So Accent Bias Britain, the training. I believe one of the links is broken. So I'm going to I'll share that with you after, Devyani. Don't worry for now. But what I'll do to everyone listening to this session, I'll collate all of the resources and share them.
Yeah,
yeah.
I can explain that actually. We
Okay.
had, it was called recruiters, and we changed it to employers because it's actually more general. So it might be that because we recently changed. Yeah, it could be that.
Yeah, amazing. So I think Matilda's commented Accent Bias Britain / training for employers. So that's the right link.
Yes,
So
I'll change it in my slides, which are older. Yeah. Amazing.
We'll share your slides as well, Devyani. So let's have a look at a couple of questions. We've had loads of comments from people just to say that it's super interesting. And let's have a look at this. So there is, from Grace from PwC, there is some criticism of the education system in increasing accent bias. So Ofsted being one of the reasons for this. So is there much research into accent bias in the British education system itself?
Yeah, there is some. It's a very good question. I mentioned at the beginning of my talk a few examples of teachers being told after an Ofsted inspection, not by Ofsted, but by their school, to cut down. There were a few different accents, but also teachers just expressing their own discomfort with their accent. There's also, it's not just accent, also grammar and lexicon. So there's some issues, so with the attitudes to slang is very interesting because you see schools listing forbidden slang. But if you look at it, it's almost exclusively slang used by minority ethnic groups. So there's, traditional white British slang is not listed. So there's a lot that's going on in the education system. It's very, it's tough for teachers because teachers take on this kind of role of equipping students with language that will help them succeed. So there's this kind of real paradox where they want to be supportive of students, but of course, if they equip them with standard grammar and standard accents, they will succeed based on, if you look at our research, yeah, it would. So it's quite, you can accept the facts about accent bias and go in two different directions. You can say, oh, there's bias, don't use your accent, just use RP, or you can take go for a deeper critique, which is what is quite important, which is that just reinforces the system. So there is research by a few people, Julia Snell, Ian Cushing, Christian Ilbery. There's a bunch of linguists working not just on accent but also just standard language expectations. But in our Sutton Trust report, teachers, we did quite a large survey with teachers and sixth formers. And we see all of these concerns, but teachers, I would say, they didn't really express these views as personal views. You don't that often see teachers committing to RP is the best and we need to eliminate our regional accents. They tend to be supportive, but they worry about that role, that they worry about. And they've also experienced a lot of comments. So in the Sutton Trust report, you can see some quotes from teachers. So it is an issue. I think that's an area where the Ofsted others are not fully aware of the wider consequences of that kind of suppression of linguistic diversity.
Brilliant. Thank you, Devyani. Really helpful. So there was another question, and then a repeat to say that some of it's been answered, but I'm going to share it anyway because it's from Sam. So some regional or ethnic accent speakers may feel that they need to tone down their accents to be understood, especially when communicating with a range of colleagues, clients internationally, for example. So is this a danger to inclusion, and what are your thoughts on, and is this common, and what are your thoughts on this, Devyani?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's also very difficult. I think it's too easy to say everybody should be, should be free to speak as they wish or as they would in their most relaxed mode, because none of us actually does. I'm accommodating to this situation, trying to be clear. So there's a degree to which that happens naturally. And I think we all have to accept that. So if we have very, very different accents from each other, it's sometimes called English as a lingua franca among, sometimes you have non-native English users speaking to each other and trying to find the common ground. So I think it's good to think of it as a continuum. There are some extreme cases where people do find they need to slow down or need to be clearer. But there's a big gray area where there's an expectation that they do that, even though people can understand or get quite used to their accent. So all of us have that experience that we know someone with an accent that was unfamiliar to us, but within a couple of weeks, we got used to it. We just learn, to get used to it. So it's definitely a danger to inclusion if it's automatically seen as a problem, and also if the burden is always on the speaker. So that's what I meant with the final point, that it's standard speakers who never face that burden, and feeling that they have to accommodate it's not really the full picture. I think that there's a lot where standard speakers or speakers not familiar with the accent can think, well, actually, I do understand this person, and it's not that they're not making an effort. I just need to be used to people speaking differently. So I think in the middle ground, there shouldn't really be an expectation of that, but we do it naturally, usually to kind of work together. Yeah, it's very complicated.
Yeah, something that probably can't be answered straight away. It takes many years of work like that you've been doing, Devyani, but really super interesting, and that answer definitely helps. I think that's probably it now for the questions. Just for the okay, there's one that's just come in. Let's have a look at this. So I'm just going to read it out. I haven't actually read it yet. Just to clarify, when we're talking to students about preparing for interviews, etc., our best approach is to encourage them to be confident and focus on the topic and knowledge rather than trying to dilute their accent.
Yes, it is. And so again, I don't like to give advice like that without some confidence that it is the case. And that's why we looked at these quite, empirically, trying to see if it's true. And it really is true. And I think intuitively people know that. If you think about when you hear somebody with an accent that you're not familiar with, when they're talking to you at work, if they're confident and focused on the content and they know what they're talking about, the accent issues just fade away and you don't really think about them. It's a very clear, well understood psychological effect where when we're listening, all of us lapse into stereotypes, that kind of we're lazy listeners. So we'll go by stereotypes if there's nothing else to latch on to. And so if people mumble and feel self-conscious, it doesn't solve the problem, it worsens the problem. So even if they feel like, there's no one around who speaks like me in this, I'm going to become a doctor, it doesn't help to try and cover it up. It's good to just speak clearly, confidently, and be knowledgeable. And I think the over-focus we found really hampers that, kind of drawing on those strengths, because you add the problem of seeming like you're not confident about what you know when actually you're just not confident about how you sound. So definitely we recommend that. We were involved in a recent film that Amol Rajan made on BBC called How to Crack the Class Ceiling. And there's it's a sequel to an earlier film he made. And in those you can see young graduates trying to break into elite professions. And you hear a couple of them who speak not confidently because of the accent, and it doesn't help them at all. So even if you see evidence of accent bias, it's better to be confident and knowledgeable and not worry too much about it. That's what makes the change.
Amazing. Thanks, Devyani. And I guess just final question from me would be linking back to what you've said already, really, but in terms of advice for everyone listening to you today intently, who are going to be managing recruitment for organizations small to large, what one piece of advice would you give them? I know you spoke about just raising awareness within their recruitment teams. Would that be a good place to start, or is it?
I think the simplest message is that this is still new enough that just mentioning it in recruiter training, even if people don't do the 15-minute thing, if you just say, by the way, people make huge assumptions based on accent. So do you, so do I. You really need to keep that in check, not just in recruiting, but in the workplace. So, having somebody feel that they don't belong just because their accent is from a particular region or social class has consequences throughout their career. And, people just don't realize, like when they mimic an accent or always make jokes about a person's accent. So just recognizing the consequences of those shortcuts and stereotypes is the first step.
Amazing. Brilliant, Devyani. Well, I'm going to let you go now. You've been really amazing, interesting. The session is definitely sparked a lot of interest for a lot of people, I'm sure. So yeah, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks. And sorry about the link. It does work if you just navigate to it from the website. It's my slides that were a bit out of date.
It's
so
okay, that's
fine. Yeah.
No problem at all.
Okay.
I will be sharing everything. Take care, Devyani.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris.
All right.
Thanks
Goodbye.
to everyone. Bye.